Yeah, and we can, yeah, and I go, yeah, and he goes, well, I always thought it was a cartoon. No, this is real stuff. This is why we told you, so we're kind of on your level. And it was, just that was kind of an eye-opener, you can see at the time. And, sometimes we can get in that kind of mode too. Kind of these nice stories. It's kind of like a 30-minute sitcom, you kind of go through it. Good entertainment, but is it really practical? Is it really practical? And I think today's some of that. Oh my goodness, this stuff is meant to be practical. It was supposed to be real life, but it is difficult. I mean, these are difficult words. They're difficult to live up to. So I was reading one person who, Buttrick was his name, George Buttrick, and he writes for pastors, preachers. And he said, yeah, Jesus gave this teaching, and we've been trying to avoid it ever since. And there's a lot of truth in that. It's a difficult passage. So we were enjoying Jesus from in his Sermon on the Plain. And those were bad enough to begin with, this kind of woe to you and blessed are you, and it's a topsy-turvy type of thing that really isn't kind of the way we think of the world. But Jesus kind of throws that in. And if you haven't left by then, this one gets worse. These are difficult things. To love one's enemies is not for wimps. It's a difficult passage. It wasn't meant to be easy. When we talk about enemies, for example, loving one's enemies, I don't know about you, but I think my blood pressure goes up a little bit, and kind of an increase in pulse and feelings of tightness in my chest and neck. Especially those people that hurt not only ourselves but hurt others. It can be very difficult and not easy. Especially when it goes on for generations. Two primitive tribes in Guinea were in constant war with one another. Constant. They had been at war with ancestral enemies for all, not of their lives, but as long as they could remember. Open hostilities would break out on a regular basis. And so these well-meaning Christian missionaries came to live with these tribes and tried everything they could demonstrate God's love, God's peace, and everything kept on failing. Even after one huge disappointing effort during peace negotiations, one tribe murdered the other's side altogether. I mean, it was horrible. And so finally, one of the chiefs had this idea that the solution was to exchange what they called peace babies. Peace babies. And the chief was to give up to the other tribe its youngest baby to be raised by the other tribe. They were supposed to do this on both sides. Well, that happened. There was an exchange of peace babies, in spite of the tears and wailing of their mothers. Could you imagine giving up that? I could not. But they did that. In exchange for the peace babies, the hostilities did end. As one chief explained, we would dare not attack the other tribe as long as our child was in the care of the other tribe. It was a novel way that missionaries didn't even think of that one. They thought it through and brought a new era of peace for these warring tribes. The missionaries later reflected, God gave us his own peace child, didn't he? Gave it to the human race. God too offered a peace baby by the name of Jesus. And we are the heirs and offspring of that peace baby. We're still the apple of God's eyes. God has delayed any consequences of the sins of the world in memory of God's only begotten, Jesus, who died and who lived among us. Part of what's going on here is Jesus looking upon people who are at odds, warring. And it's been more than a few times that in my office a young woman, usually a young woman, has come in to talk to me and wanting to get back with her husband, often the father of her her child or children. And in kind of the aftermath of either drug addictions or the result of alcoholism, he had beaten her or the children. And she had gotten away to a shelter or a family member's home. And that's been repeated several times in my ministry. Oftentimes, with the bruises, you can still see with the woman, just horrible situations. And, you know, when we start talking about things like turning the other cheek, that was meant to end retaliation rather than accepting physical or emotional or mental harm. It was not meant to take abuse for the sake of taking abuse. Turning the other cheek meant to end the hostilities, to restrain from retaliation or harm, to overcome this horrible tit for tat type of thing. But it meant more than just enduring some kind of emotional, physical trauma for the rest of your life. It's not what God was advocating. It's not what Jesus was meaning. But life can change, and people can as well. I love the story about during World War II. There was a young private and very religious young man, and he continued that through his time in the service. He prayed every night, read his Bible. Sergeant was constantly berating him, demeaning him. Come on, you wimp, why do you need to do that? One night, when the sergeant came back, going through the private's living quarters, he saw the private kneeling at his bed in prayers. And the sergeant, who had been drinking heavily, took one of his heavy, muddy boots off and threw it at the private, hit him in the head, knocked him over. The private got up and resumed his prayers. And then second shoe comes off, flings it, hits him, falls down, comes back up, starts praying again. And finally, as the sergeant took off, he said some colorful words and fell into his drunken slumber. That morning he woke up a little hungover. But what he saw under his bed was his shoes spotlessly shined and sitting neatly under his bunk. With tears in his eyes, he came to the private and said, I've tried to remold you in my image, and instead you've touched my heart to remold me. See, sometimes it works. The retaliation ends. Many of you probably read Corey Ten Boom's books about her time in the concentration camps during World War II. She encountered a guard after those times who had been a guard at the Ravensbrück prison camp, and he had become a Christian and wanted to reach out and thank her. And of course, not only what she went through, but the people that she knew in that concentration camp where they came through just welled up in her. And she said she found in just taking his hand the power of forgiveness. She wrote, those survivors of the prison camps who were able to forgive their former enemies were able to return to the outside world and rebuild their lives. No matter what the physical scars, those who nursed their bitterness remained invalids. It was as simple and as horrible as that. Forgiveness has a place, not only for the other, but for ourselves. You know what's kind of interesting in this passage? Jesus never identifies who the enemy is. You know, sometimes we think it's out there, sometimes it's in here. Sometimes it's personal, and sometimes it's within our whole society. Enemies without. Who is my enemy? One great quote that's often attributed to Abraham Lincoln goes like this: I do not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends. In other words, when we convert enemies to our friends, we've solved the problem. May that be so. May that happen. Una Kroll in her book, Forgive and Live, writes to forgive means to release someone from the ultimate punishment that's rightly due that person for the hurt they've caused. The famous late United Nations Secretary Dag Hammarskjöld writes in his markings, forgiveness breaks the chain of causality, because he who forgives you out of love takes upon themselves the consequences of what you have done. So it's that sort of sense that Jesus' death on the cross took with him the sins of the world and put them on a cross for us. There's a power of forgiveness, but it's not easy. But thanks be to God when it happens. I've witnessed that in society several times. You know, a few years ago, you guys remembered when I was trying to use up some frequent flyer miles or lose them, so I was looking into some more biblical type of things, and those didn't kind of pan out. I was looking for this and that. Finally, I found a place to go. Study leave in Ireland, and I was studying mostly Celtic spirituality, Christian spirituality. But one of the tours I took was of the northern walls there. And during my high school time, we would talk about the Troubles, and for generations, these Irish people have been fighting one another. Mostly on one side Catholic and the other side Protestant, but really it wasn't religious as much as it was ongoing social, political, economic issues. And they would look back for generations. I mean, all the way back to Queen Elizabeth I, I heard stories, where there were bombings and brutality and if you look back in the history, horrible history of a Christian nation, both claiming Christian. But what solved that problem was looking toward the future. It was like a peace baby. They started looking at, is this the society? Is this how we want our children to be raised for the rest of their lives as our lives were? And finally, both sides agreed, no, we don't want this for our children. They were able to come beyond that. Were there atrocities on both sides? Yes. But were they able to overcome that? See, when we talk about love in the New Testament, oftentimes we think of love as kind of that warmth of the heart and of being so, it's just this euphoric kind of wonderful feeling. Actually, love in the New Testament is more of an action, how to be the best for the other people. And it's like those Irish people trying to overcome the problems they were having with one another. And sometimes this is how we need to act. I mean, I didn't like the solution that General MacArthur had in the Korean War, but he often said he wanted a quick war for that to end so that the Korean farmers can get back to their fields so they wouldn't starve the next season. That was a concern that he had for the Korean people. Maybe not the best example and the best way of doing it, but there was a concern there, much like after post-World War I, of rebuilding up our former enemies, Germany and Japan. Kind of strange now I'm having a son who's married to a Japanese national. Could you imagine 50 years ago that happening? Probably not. Not in my family. Life can change. Life can change. William Carlos Williams talked about this power of forgiveness, overcoming hatred, in his poem, Pictures from Bruegel. He said, what power has love but forgiveness? In other words, by love's intervention, what has been done can be undone. What good is love otherwise? This promise forgiveness is in the heart and soul of love. Difficult words. Remember your Sunday school lessons way back when? Remember Joseph? We got the end part of Joseph in the first lesson. We didn't get the whole build-up, right? So remember who Joseph was the son of? Who his father was?
Jacob.
Jacob, who was also
Israel.
Israel. You were first service.
I read my Bible, yes.
So, how many brothers did he have?
11.
Yeah, 11. Shut up! You're not in first service. You know all the answers. There's Paul's answer. So how old was he? Bible doesn't say. So his father. So he was what, the dreamer, right? So do you remember the first dreams he had with his brothers and father and mother?
They would
Yeah, they were to bow down. They had two of them. What was the first one?
that they would bow down and worship.
Yeah. So the one was with the sheaves, and then they had stars, and so there were both of these. So that made his brothers really happy, right?
Huh?
Not. So what did his father give him?
A multicolored coat.
Yeah, a coat of many colors. Have you ever seen Jacob in the
A Technicolor.
Technicolor
Dream coat.
Yeah. So I had one of my high school buddies was in that musical. Anyway, so they were happy about that, right? Not. They were jealous, right? So he goes out there, I'm going to go see my brothers out in the fields, and what do they do?
Put him down the well.
Knock him out and put him down a hole.
Yeah, they threw him down the well, right? And they were going to kill him, but I think it was Judah that said, no, well, let's not kill him. So they threw him down the hole, and then what did they do?
Sold him.
They sold him to who? Ishmaelites, well, Median traders. And they were going to where?
Egypt.
Egypt, right. So so he was spared from that, and then they bring to father this coat of many colors, and it's all bloody. They put, it was goat, wasn't it? I'll have to look that up. It was either sheep or goat blood, and they put him to father. And look what happened to Joseph. So he's sold down there. He's sold to a person by the name of Potiphar. You guys are good now. You're on a roll. So, and then the Potiphar's wife got the hots for him, and Joseph took the blame, and he was in prison. But while he was in prison, God didn't forget him. He didn't have anything to forgive at that point. So in prison, he interprets dreams, and he interprets dreams for the butler and the wine steward, and the dreams come true. One of them's pretty bad, but they come true, and then the butler tells the Pharaoh about this, and because the Pharaoh's having dreams, right? These really kind of strange things about thin cows and fat cows, and I guess fat first, and then 7 thin ones, and then so Joseph is brought out of prison, tells the Pharaoh what to do, and kind of says, not only are you going to have 7 years of plenty, you're going to have 7 years of starvation, famine, and so you better do something about this. And I would say rain during the thing, and you need to find a person to kind of fill that. You need to be intelligent, you need to be insightful. So Pharaoh goes, "Oh, what'd you do?" So Joseph becomes like this right-hand man of the Pharaoh, powerful guy. Well, during the famine, that's what we hear about these brothers are coming up, right? And they come up trying to buy grain, and then they behold, there's all the money's back in our bags. So then that's not enough grain, so they have to come back up again. And this time Joseph starts playing like a cat and mouse kind of game with them. He's going back and forth. And part of that is checking out, did you really care for one another? Do you really care for my brother through my mom, Benjamin? Do you really care for this person? Do you really care about your father? Have you repented of your sin? He plays with them, and he's checking that out. See, we don't hear that part of the story in this forgiveness. We hear the very end. See, sometimes we think forgiveness is instantaneous, and it just happens like this. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes we need to process this. Sometimes that's the way that God does. We hear the very end of the story, and it's a beautiful ending. Oh my goodness, it's one of my favorite parts in the whole Old Testament. But we got to remember that it didn't happen overnight. And sometimes when we think of forgiveness, loving enemies. This is not something that you just put a magic wand, it's going to happen. Sometimes it's a process we need to work through. And God is willing to work it through with us. That's the beauty of that Joseph story. God never forgot Joseph, but he never forgot the brokenness that that family was going through either. And they were able to work it through for good, for life. God had a purpose beyond all the hurt that had gone through that time. God has a purpose for you and me.